Hello everyone. I am going to discuss chapter number 7 in this session, that is fiscal policy. But before going to start discussing this topic, that is fiscal policy, I want to talk about briefly recessionary gap, inflationary gap, and self-adjustment process. So we are going to review these three topics first and then start this new chapter, fiscal policy. So by recessionary gap, you know that when actual GDP, which I wrote here YE, that is equilibrium real GDP, is less than full employment level of output. So the economy is experiencing a recessionary gap if its actual real GDP is less than its potential GDP. And by potential GDP, I mean GDP at full employment level of output. In other words, in recessionary gap, the economy is in the contractionary phase of the business cycle. Recessionary gap is also, basically associated with this problem, that is the problem of unemployment. So whenever I say that the economy is in recessionary gap, it means that the economy is facing a problem of unemployment. Similarly, if actual GDP or real GDP, that is YE equilibrium GDP, if it is greater than full employment GDP, we say that the economy is in or is experiencing an inflationary gap. And this is associated with the problem of inflation. So if you have inflation in our economy, this is reflected by this inflationary gap. And you know what is this inflationary gap? When real GDP, that is actual GDP, is higher than full employment GDP. So one, view to solve these two problems. What are those two problems? The problem of unemployment and the problem of inflation without doing anything. That is, without any government intervention, these two problems can be solved. How? This is the adjustment process that we call self-adjustment process. So if the economy is in a recessionary gap, that is, if we have unemployment in the country, what would happen with this unemployment? Wage rate will decrease. Why? Because there are so many unemployed people looking for a job. So employers will offer you lower wages, and that will decrease the cost of production. When the cost of production decreases, producers have incentive to produce more. Why? Because the profit margin actually has gone up because of the lower cost of production. So the supply curve, that is aggregate supply curve, shifts to the right. And the gap is closed. The gap means the recessionary gap is closed. So if I draw this diagram here, a real small diagram, so you see what is happening actually. This is aggregate demand. This is aggregate supply. This is equilibrium YE. Full employment is somewhere here. So this is full employment YFE. Now see this gap. This is the recessionary gap. That is, actual GDP is less than full employment. So according to this self-adjustment process, government should not do anything. Because of this process that I just discussed, the supply curve will shift to the right. So I shift the supply curve, aggregate supply curve, like this. See, the new equilibrium is once again at the full employment level. So there's no unemployment. The gap is closed, is eliminated through this whole process. The reverse is true for inflation. So if the economy is facing this problem, then we have overemployment in the economy. Wage rate will increase because it's difficult to find workers. Cost of production will increase. Supply curve shifts to the left instead of right, and closing the inflationary gap. So the diagram will be very similar, but for the inflationary situation, you have to draw different diagrams. That is, your actual GDP must be more than full employment GDP, and you have to shift the aggregate supply curve to the left instead of right that I shifted for recessionary gap scenario. So the problem with this solution is actually based on this assumption that wages or wage rate is flexible. Wage rate is flexible. That is the problem. So in this whole self-adjustment process, we are assuming that wages are flexible in both directions, upward and downward. But because of the labor, your uh, because of your what you call uh, contracts and because of the labor union, wages are not flexible, particularly downward. So when you sign a contract, right, employment contract, you sign that you will be getting this amount for the next whole year, for the next 2 years, or for the next 3 years. So during that period of time, your wage rate is fixed. So even if there's unemployment or overemployment, wage rate will not fall. And therefore, this process will not continue to, uh, this process will not actually lead to closing the recessionary gap. So that is the problem. And this problem is highlighted by Keynesian economists, those economists who follow Keynesian or Keynesian analysis. What is the Keynesian solution? Keynesian solution is they believe that is, this group believes that the adjustment process is not automatic because of the because wages are rigid, wages are sticky, because of sticky wages, because wages are not flexible. So because of this, this process is not automatic. And we have to use these two policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy, to close these gaps. So because of the Keynesian economist, because of the sticky wages, the process is not automatic. That is, this adjustment process is not automatic. And therefore, we will have to use these two policies, fiscal and monetary policies, to close these gaps. In this chapter, we will focus only on fiscal policy. We will discuss monetary policy in chapter number 8 and 9, basically chapter 9. So let's talk about fiscal policy. Oops, sorry. Just give me a sec. Yeah. So fiscal policy basically is a government's approach toward its own spending and taxation. So basically, by fiscal policy, I mean only two components. Or basically, fiscal policy is related to only two factors. One, government expenditures. Second, taxes. Taxes means tax revenues, basically. So Minister of Finance presents an annual budget to Parliament each spring. And this budget contains estimates of just two things, that is government revenues, basically from taxes or from non-tax revenues as well, all types of revenues. But here we are only in fiscal policy, we are only emphasizing taxes. We are only considering tax revenues, not other types of revenues, and expenditures, government expenditures. So we are going to play with the government expenditures and tax revenues. So let me show you first. Let me go back. So this is the latest data. If you get time, make sure you just visit this website and read the latest Alberta budget. This is a provincial budget, so you know what is the total revenue of our province and what are the total expenditures. Okay. Similarly, you can also visit this website and read about federal budget, that is for the federal government, 2023-24. What I'm going to show you this sample budget 2019. I know it's old, but if you look at the 2023-24 budget, it will look like very similar, except you have different numbers. So it does not make any difference. But I've already given you the links that will where you can find these two budget information. That is provincial budget, Alberta budget, and federal budget. Look at this budget. So these are different revenues categories: personal income taxes, corporate and other income taxes. These are tax revenues. EI premiums, this is not tax revenue. GST, excise, and energy taxes, including tariff revenues. These are also different types of taxes. Then we have non-tax revenues as well. It will, include income from government crown corporations. So this is also government revenue. That is revenue from postal services, and that is Canada Post, and other government investments, and Bank of Canada earnings. So these are different types of earnings, and if you add all these earnings, these are total earning of the federal government, and that is $332.2 billions. That is $1 billion. Okay. Then we have expenses. So these are different types of federal government's expenditures: transfers to persons, old age security, EI program, etc. So this is different, welfare programs where government is spending money. Spending grants to other levels of government: post-secondary education, health, social assistance. So EI program is not basically social assistance or social services, because these programs, you are actually contributing to your EI in the form of EI premiums, right? And then when you get laid off, then you will apply for EI insurance. So this is insurance. This is not, this is because you're paying premium. So employment insurance premium. So this is insurance. This is not social services. I'm sorry, I said social services. This is social services. That is spending grants to other levels of government: post-secondary education, health, other social assistance program, equalization payments. So federal government gives money to different provinces for equalization purposes, aid to less developed countries as well. So this is another type of government expenditures. Then we have public debt charges. So government borrows money, and then government will have to pay back interest plus principal amount. So for this year, that is 2019, government paid $23 billion in the form of interest and principal payments on national debt. We'll discuss national debt in a moment. Then we have direct program spending. And I wrote in the bracket capital G. This is the G that we use in our aggregate demand and aggregate expenditure function. If you remember, C plus I plus G. That G is this G. So this is basically the policy variable. Direct program spending, not these expenditures. We are only including this one. This is the policy variable. G, that will include computers for the government office or government offices, salaries of the civil services, and other expenditures, direct expenditures of the government. So total expenses would be 346.2. You can see that expenditures are more than total revenues. So the federal budget deficit is $14 billion. Normally, since I wrote deficit, that's why I'm writing 14, but normally we write deficit in negative number. So negative 14 means that you have a budget deficit of $14 billion. So now let's talk about this budget deficit and budget surplus, but I'm not going to discuss the budget deficit and budget surplus by taking all types of expenditures and all types of revenues. So for this analysis, we are just discussing budget deficit and budget surplus or balanced budget by taking only two components. One is tax revenues, which I call net tax revenue, and the other one is government expenditures, that is capital G. So these are the two components that we are going to consider only, not everything. NTR, net tax revenue, and then we consider this capital G as direct government expenditures. Using these two variables, we are going to discuss budget deficit, budget surplus, and balanced budget. If you notice, it says net tax revenue is tax revenues minus transfer payments. So transfer payments are basically, sorry. So if you see here, so transfer payments basically are in the form of grants, right? So spending grants to other level of government, post-secondary education, health, social assistance is basically a transfer payment, right? So we just subtract this from the tax revenues. So, I don't want to confuse you. I don't want to consider all these factors in our calculation. That would be pretty cumbersome, right? And I want to keep it simple as this is in your textbook, basically. So what we are going to assume, just for the sake of simplicity, that there are no transfer payments. So when there are no transfer payments, net tax revenue is basically just tax revenues. We are assuming that we have already subtracted all transfer payments. Okay. Now, so budget balance is this. This is the formula you have to remember. Net tax revenue minus government expenditures. So by calculating these, I don't know what to call it. By calculating this difference, that is NTR minus G, we will be able to determine whether we have budget deficit, budget surplus, or balance budgets. So let's take more, more precise definitions of these two concepts. Number one, what is budget surplus? The definition is given here. Budget surplus is net tax revenue in excess of government spending on goods and services. That is, when taxes are greater than government expenditures. So if you remember, I told you in the previous slide that you remember this. You remember this, right? This. NTR minus G. So I'm doing the same thing here. So if you have budget surplus, then NTR, net tax revenue. Instead of writing T, taxes, I'm just writing full NTR, and then I write G minus G, and this difference must be greater than 0, must be positive number. Why? Because if taxes, this NTR is greater than this G, we have a positive answer. So whatever answer we get, we must get positive answer. So budget surplus is always, is always represented as a positive number. So let me give you an example. Suppose this is 200 and government expenditure is only 100. So the difference is 100, which is greater than, which is a positive number. So we have a budget surplus of 100. What is budget deficit? Exactly opposite. When your net tax revenue and when your net tax revenue and when you subtract G it is a negative number, less than zero, negative number. How? Like this. Suppose net tax revenue is 100, government expenditure is 200. So 100 minus 200 is actually minus 100. So it's a negative number. So budget deficit would be $100 billion. Negative sign indicates this deficit. Positive sign indicates surplus. Okay. What if they both are equal? So if they both are equal, that is here. Look at this. If G and T both are equal, or let me put this way, if NTR is exactly equal to G, or in other words, NTR minus G equal to 0. Okay. If this is the case, we say that the budget is balanced or balanced budget. So remember, by balanced budget, I mean that government is spending money that is exactly equal to its tax revenues. So government is receiving revenues in the form of taxes, $100, then government must, spend $100, not more than $100. If government spends more than $100, that would be a deficit. If it spends less than $100, it would be a surplus. If it is exactly equal to $100, that is balanced budget. Then we have a definition of national debt. What is national debt? It is the sum of the federal government's budget deficits less its surplus. So every year, let's start from 1950 up to 2022. So we write uh, deficit, surplus, deficit, surplus, like this, right? So every year we have the federal government is either running a deficit or a surplus. So if we add all deficit first and then subtract all surpluses, whatever we get is called national debt. So national debt is basically a cumulative measure. By cumulative measure means we are adding everything. We add all deficits and then we subtract all surplus so that we have net deficit for all years together at the same time. So don't worry, I will have one example at the end of this lecture where we calculate this national debt. So you have a pretty clear idea at that time when we discuss this. So as I told you that fiscal policy is government's approach toward its expenditures and taxes. So basically, these are the two what we call fiscal tools. So let me write here. This is fiscal tools. So federal government will use these tools, that is its own expenditures and taxes, to solve the problem of unemployment and inflation, because according to Keynesian analysis, wages are sticky and therefore the automatic adjustment process will not work and government will do something. So federal government will use these two tools, fiscal tools, its own expenditures and taxes, to control the problem of unemployment and inflation. Now, these two variables, that is government expenditures and taxes, using these two together, we can calculate whether the government is running a deficit or a surplus. These two variables are dependent on these variables. What are these variables? So these tools separately. So basically, using G and T, we can calculate budget, government budget. What is government budget? Net net tax revenue minus G. This is government budget. If this number is negative, this whole number is in the bracket, then we have deficit. If it's positive, we surplus. If they're both equal, we have balanced budget. Now, this budget, that is government budget, depends on three factors which are given here. These three factors. Two of them are very simple. So government budget changes if tax revenue changes. Government budget changes if government expenditures changes. Of course, if government starts spending more money, then government will probably be running a deficit. because you are spending more without increasing your revenues. So you have to borrow money. That is what we call deficit. So these two variables are direct, G and NTR. That's why at the outset I said these are the two variables, important variables, calculating government budget. These two are this: a change in the amount of government revenue, a change in the amount of government spending. These two variables will determine your government budget. There's another variable, and that is the level of GDP. Why? Because if per capita income of Canada increases, what would happen? Government will receive more revenues. Why? Because now I'm earning more, so I have to pay more taxes to the government, and therefore this NTR will increase. So net tax revenue will increase directly by increasing the tax rate by the government, or NTR increases because of the increase in income as well. So basically, there are three variables that will determine this government budget. So now there are three schools of thought on fiscal policy. So let me discuss briefly these three views. One view, according to the first view, and that view is basically what we call Keynesian analysis. This view says that government should use counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So don't worry about it. The term, we will discuss this. So counter-cyclical. That is, remember in business cycle, we have cycles. So we are at the peak, then we have contractionary phase of the business cycle, then we have trough, and then we have expansionary expansionary phase of the business cycle. So for example, see this. In a business cycle, suppose we have real GDP here. I could have taken growth in real GDP as well. That is actually given in your textbook, but this is much easier if I take real GDP and time here. So suppose if you are here, this is the peak and this is the trough. This region, this in between these two, this region, this is a contractionary phase. By contractionary phase of the business cycle, I mean that the economy is in a recessionary gap. That is, we have unemployment in the country. So what we have to do, we have to counter this cycle. We have to move the economy from this cycle to the expansionary phase of the business cycle. We don't want unemployment. That is why we call it counter-cyclical fiscal policy. So we have to counter the cycle. If we are in the contractionary phase, we have to counter it. If we are in the expansionary phase, we have to counter. Okay. So let me erase this so that you can read it. Hold on a second. So counter-cyclical fiscal policy. What is this policy? See this. When faced with a recession, the government should overspend, deficit, and when faced with an inflationary boom, should underspend, surplus, in order to help the economy achieve the goals of full employment and stable prices. Okay. Now let me just explain this. I know this is confusing, but it's very simple when I explain you in this fashion. Whenever there's unemployment in the country, whenever there's unemployment in the country, the counter-cyclical fiscal policy is to increase government expenditure and decrease taxes. Why? Because I've shown you whenever there's a recessionary gap, then government should increase aggregate demand curve. And remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So G component, you have to increase the G. So the government expenditure increases so that the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right because we are producing less than the full employment level of output. I will show the diagram, don't worry about it. Or we can also decrease, V means government, can also decrease tax rates. Why? Because if you decrease tax rate, then people have more money to spend, and therefore they are going to spend more money. So consumption will increase and aggregate demand curve shifts to a rightward, right? So this is the fiscal policy. Increase in G or decrease in T. When? When the economy is experiencing a recessionary gap. When the economy is experiencing an inflationary gap instead of recessionary gap, the policy would be exactly opposite. The policy would be then decrease G or increase T. Exactly opposite. You have to reduce the demand. Right now we have inflation in the country, and the government, federal government and Bank of Canada will discuss in the monetary policy. Government tries to decrease the aggregate demand by either decreasing expenditure or increasing tax revenues. Okay. You know that these two factors, that is G and T, are parts of the budget, government budget. So in the recessionary gap, if government increases its expenditures or decreases taxes, what would happen? Government will run a deficit then. So suppose you start with a balanced budget. That is, government is spending $100 and receiving $100 in revenues. Everything is fine. Now you have unemployment in the country. Then the solution would be to increase government expenditures. So when government expenditures increase without changing tax revenues, the government is going to run a deficit. Government will have to borrow money in order to spend, because government does not have enough money to spend. So we have deficit in this case. In this case, government is decreasing the expenditure or increasing taxes. That will create surplus. That will create surplus. So see what is happening. If you use counter-cyclical fiscal policy to solve the problem of unemployment or inflation, we have another problem. And the another problem is that when you try to solve the problem of unemployment, government is going to run deficit, budget deficit. And if you're trying to control inflation in the economy, then government will run a surplus. So running a surplus is not something bad, but running a deficit is definitely something bad. Okay. So this is one school of thought. So this school, that is Keynesian school, these economists believe that don't worry about budget deficit or budget surplus. Just try to solve the problem of unemployment and inflation. The second school of thought is exactly opposite of the first one. This group believes that budget should be balanced every single year. Even if we are facing a problem of unemployment or inflation, don't worry about it. They actually believe in automatic adjustment process or self-adjustment process. So these economists believe that don't try to fix the problem of unemployment and inflation. It will be taken care of automatically. Just be careful that government should not run a deficit or surplus. Budget should be balanced every year, every single year. This policy is called balanced budget fiscal policy. Balanced budget fiscal policy. That is, balancing the budget annually is a prime aim of fiscal policy. So this is the aim of the government. The budget annually is a prime aim of fiscal policy. So this is the aim of the government, to balance the budget. Forget about solving the problem of unemployment and inflation, because these two problems will be solved automatically. The third view is actually the combination or amalgamation of these two views. So these economies actually combine these two views together, and they say that counter-cyclical fiscal policy and balanced budget fiscal policy, these two policies are important. So what government should do, government should try to solve the problem of unemployment and run a deficit. That's fine. And then government should control the problem of inflation and run surplus. But after the whole cycle, let's say after 5 years, they should have a balanced budget, because for first, let's say 2 years, you are running a deficit because you have problem of unemployment. Then the next 3 years, you are running a surplus because now you have an inflationary gap instead of recessionary gap. Then these two gap must be equal, so that after the end of 5 years, after the end of one business cycle, you have balanced budget. So this is what is written here: cyclically balanced budget policy. The second one was balanced budget. This says cyclically balanced budget. That is, you have to balance the budget not every year, but in one whole cycle, one business cycle, uh, which is combination of the above two. So see this. If I draw here, this is the business cycle. So suppose this is one cycle, right? From trough to trough. So you have expansion and then you have recession or contraction. So the third view, the third group is saying that during expansionary phase, government is running a surplus. During contractionary phase, government running a deficit. So these, after this whole time period, this is not 1 year, this may be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So after this completion of one cycle, government should be running a balanced budget. So you have to balance the budget not every year, but every cycle. Okay. Let me discuss these three views in more detail. Okay. So this is counter cyclical fiscal policy. And I have already given you here. So if you have a recessionary gap, by you, I mean if a country is facing a recessionary problem of a recessionary gap, this. Don't get confused with YP. YP is actually potential GDP. That is YFE. And this Y is equilibrium income. So if equilibrium income is less than potential income, we have a recessionary gap, that is unemployment. What is the solution? What is the fiscal policy? Increase in government expenditures. You have to increase G. How? Through borrowing. So government will borrow money by issuing government bonds. Government can also print money through the central bank, that is Bank of Canada, or decrease in taxes. These are the two options. So either government during unemployment, either government reduce tax rates or increase its own expenditure. These are the two options, or both at the same time together. Then these two policies will shift the demand curve, aggregate demand curve to the right. But when you increase G and when you decrease T, that will create budget deficit. That is the problem with counter-cyclical fiscal policy, that you run a budget deficit. According to the second group, they say don't fix this problem. Just try to keep your budget balanced. But counter-cyclical fiscal policies, okay, doesn't matter. Just face budget deficit problem, but solve the problem of unemployment. For inflationary case, exactly opposite. Decrease in G, increase in T, aggregate demand shifts to the left, you have budget surplus. So in inflationary gap, you have budget surplus. In recessionary gap, you have budget deficit. I can show you this diagrammatically. So this is the diagram. See, you can see in this diagram that the equilibrium initially was at this point. This is YE. And full employment output is this, because this is long run aggregate. They wrote LA potential GDP, but you could have written LAS, right? That is long run aggregate supply. So we have inflationary gap, this gap. Then government increases its expenditure or reducing, decreases its own taxes. The aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, that you can see here, using increasing government expenditures only. And it will intersect here. Why? Because that is also at the LAS curve. And you can see the new equilibrium is at YFE. So there's no problem of unemployment. The economy is operating at full employment. But notice, now government is running a budget deficit. This is counter-cyclical fiscal policy, inflationary gap. So if inflationary gap, you are initially here. This is your equilibrium, which is greater than the full employment level. So government will have to shift aggregate demand curve to the left by decreasing its own expenditures. So aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, and you see gap is gone. But the government is running a surplus. Why? Because surplus is what? NTR, net tax revenue minus G. This component is decreasing. So the whole ratio is increasing. So you are the government is running a surplus instead of a deficit. Now, these are some of the problems associated with counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Number one, it is subject to serious time lags. So, for example, if we have unemployment right now, it is not easy to approve funds for government expenditures. You need to approval from so many different, steps. It takes time. So, for example, if government decides to build a new hospital, what do you think? The government will construct this hospital in 1 month? It takes months and months for paperwork and so many approvals, so many things. So it has a time lag. That is one problem with this policy. Number two, the crowding out effect. What is crowding out effect? When government increases its own expenditures by borrowing money from either issuing bonds, what would happen? We'll discuss this. The interest rate increases. Why interest rate increases? Because the demand for borrowed funds increases, and therefore the lender will charge you higher prices. So interest rate will increase. This increase in interest rate will discourage private investors. So, for example, if government is borrowing heavily, interest rate will go up. If I'm a private investor, I'm not going to borrow money for my investment because my profit margin is much lower than the interest payment that I'm going to pay because of that higher interest rate. So I'm not going to invest in that project. This uh, phenomenon is called crowding out effect. By crowding out effect, I mean that government investments or government expenditures actually crowd out private investments. So private investors are not um, enter uh, in this market because government is spending heavily. So that is one another problem, that it crowds out private investment. And third, which I've already discussed, it can cause serious budget deficits only in case of a recessionary gap. Now, this is the second view, balanced budget fiscal policy. According to this group, they say that government budget should be balanced each year. Don't worry about unemployment or inflation. So according to this view, if the country is facing a recessionary gap, then by recessionary gap, I mean we have high unemployment rate. So when we have high unemployment rate, according to this view, government will not need to do anything. Why? Because everything will be adjusted using this automatic stabilizer. What is automatic stabilizer? What they are saying, that this group is saying, that whenever you have a recessionary gap, according to the first view, whenever you have high unemployment rate, according to first view, they say that government should increase its expenditure, right? Now, the second group is saying that government should not need to or should not increase its own expenditures. Why? Because government expenditures will increase automatically. How? See this. So, if you have high unemployment rate, what would happen? Government will spend more money on employment insurance because more people will apply for employment insurance, so they will be getting money from there. Government will have to spend more on social programs because people are not working, and therefore government expenditures are increasing in different social programs. Also, the other policy is tax decrease in tax revenue. Government should not, decrease tax rates. Why? Because government is already receiving less revenues. Why? Because of unemployment. If people are not working, tax revenue will decrease automatically. You don't need to decrease these tax rate. Um, there should not be a discretionary decrease in taxes. Tax revenues are already decreasing. So the second group says that don't increase your expenditure, it will automatically be increasing, and tax revenue will automatically be decreasing. So that is not the point. The point is that government should balance its budget. So suppose if there's a deficit, then government should decrease its expenditure and increase taxes. If surplus, government should increase its expenditure and, decrease tax revenues. So let's see this. So I'm supposing that suppose the economy is also running a budget deficit. Then according to the second group, to balance the budget, what is budget deficit? Budget deficit is this I'm writing here. Net tax revenue minus G must be less than zero, negative number. That is, this G is greater than NTR. Government expenditures are higher than net tax revenues. This is the meaning of deficit. How you are going to balance? You have basically two ways. Either you decrease your expenditures or you increase your revenues. This is common sense, not common sense in a way that you don't know. The common sense, let me, I should not have used actually this term common sense. This is not common sense, let me put it this way. Basically, let's take an example of an individual on individual basis, right? So suppose if I'm running a deficit, okay? So I'm running a deficit. What I'm going to do? I have only two options. Either I reduce my expenditures, my expenses. So I go to different restaurants. I have to reduce these trips. I have to reduce my expenses on shoes, on so many different items. This is one way. Or the second way is to increase my income. To maybe if I'm working 20 hours, I will then be working 30 hours. So either you increase your resources, income, or decrease your expenditure. These are the only two ways you can avoid deficit. This is what I'm saying here, that if the government is running a deficit, then there's only two solutions. Either decrease your own expenditures, don't spend too much if you don't have money, or if you want to spend, it's important, then you have to finance your money by raising taxes. Just impose higher taxes on consumers, on citizens, so that you have more finance your money by raising taxes. Just impose higher taxes on consumers, on citizens, so that you have more money to spend. Okay. So now notice one important thing, and that I want you to understand. Let me first delete this and then write here so that you know what I'm saying. Remember, in the first view, we discussed these two policies: increase in G, decrease in taxes. In this policy, that is balanced budget fiscal policy, since we have budget deficit, the policy is decrease taxes or decrease some government expenditure or increase taxes in order to balance the budget. Notice, just compare these two policies. This policy, exactly opposite. So if we have unemployment in the country, the first view is suggesting that you should follow these policies. The second view is suggesting that government should follow this policy. So if you follow this policy, that is second view, that is exactly opposite of first view, it will increase more unemployment in the country. Let me show you here. Hold on a second. This. See this diagram. In this diagram, if you remember, I said you are here and the policy is to increase G and shift the aggregate demand gap to the right. This is the first view. The second view, that is, this is counter-cyclical fiscal policy. Balanced budget fiscal policy argues that, those who favor this uh, view, that government should decrease its expenditures. So you are actually shifting aggregate demand further to the left instead of right. So the new equilibrium GDP would be somewhere here, would be somewhere here. See, the gap has increased. Instead of eliminating this gap, the second view is actually increasing the recessionary gap. Why? Because they are not interested in this problem. They are interested in balancing the budget. So if you see here, the second view, that is balanced budget fiscal policy, read what is happening here. So when you have a recessionary gap and also a budget deficit, so if you have budget deficit and if you have a recessionary gap, their policy is to balance the budget. Simple. That is decrease G or increase T. What would happen? You have more unemployment, more unemployment. See, this policy is called pro-cyclical. What is the meaning of pro-cyclical? That is, the economy is in the contractionary phase and you are increasing the severity of unemployment. So you are now going down further at the bottom. That is trough. So this is pro-cyclical, that you are in the one cycle. So you're not reverting this cycle. You are pushing the economy towards the same cycle further down. That is why I'm calling it pro-cyclical. Remember, the first view is counter-cyclical. You're countering those cycles. So if you're in the contractionary phase, you are trying to take the economy back to the expansionary phase. That is counter-cyclical. This is pro-cyclical because you are not interested solving that problem. You're interested in balancing the budget. So this will worsen the recessionary gap. So you have higher recessionary gap. This is the balanced budget fiscal policy in case of inflationary gap. Exactly opposite. So in inflationary gap, we have a budget surplus. And I'm not going to discuss automatic stabilizer. You know, is exactly opposite. If everyone is working, then the government will receive higher tax revenues. So you have basically more surplus because government expenditures are not increasing. Why? Because people are employed. So government does not need to spend more on social welfare programs, does not need to pay employment insurance because everyone is working. And therefore, the problem, according to this group, you don't need to worry about inflationary gap. What you have to do, just solve the problem of budget surplus. So in budget surplus, if you want to balance the budget, you have two options. If you have surplus, either you can just spend that additional amount that you have additional revenues. So either you increase government expenditures or you decrease tax revenues because you have plenty of revenues. That's why you have surplus. Surplus means when net tax revenues are higher than government expenditures. How can you balance? Either increase government expenditures or decrease taxes. Then you have more employment. So if you have inflation in the country, that inflation will further increase. And this policy is once again pro-cyclical. So you are in the inflationary gap. This policy will increase the gap. So this will increase the severity of inflation and worsen inflationary gap. Okay. This is the third policy, which is pretty logical because it includes both views together. Balance the budget over the length of the business cycle instead of 1 year. So run a deficit. So there's no harm if government is running a deficit to reduce unemployment during recessionary gaps. So we have budget deficit and run a surplus to reduce inflation during inflationary gaps. That is, we have budget surplus. So assume one business cycle covers 5 years, suppose. So 3 years of recession and 2 years of expansion. That is 2 years for contractionary phase and 3 years of expansionary phase. Run a deficit in the first 3 years because you have contractionary phase for 3 years, and then run a surplus in the later 2 years. But make sure that when you add all these 5 years deficit and surplus, you must get zero answer. That is, your budget is balanced during that whole 5 years. Now, what are the shortcomings of cyclically balanced budget fiscal policy? No guarantee that the size and length of the recessionary gap will exactly offset the size and length of the inflationary gap. So that is the problem. So for example, if government keeps, is spending more money, solve the problem of recessionary gap for the continuous 4 years. So you are running a huge budget deficit. But when you enter in the expansionary phase of the business cycle, you have only 1 year of that expansionary period. And you have surplus of, let's say, $100, whereas for the last 4 years, you have $500 deficit. So even you are running a budget deficit after 5 years, $400. That is 500 minus 100. So that is one problem. Second, increasing government spending in bad times is politically easy. That is, because what they are saying, let me underline so that you know what I'm saying. They are saying that, let me go here, hold on a second. They are saying run a deficit when you have inflationary gap, and run a surplus when you have, or recessionary gap, I'm sorry, when you have inflationary gaps. So see what is happening here. They are saying that if you have unemployment in the country, right, that is, if the economy is in the contractionary phase of the business cycle, or if the country is experiencing a recessionary gap, then the policy is to increase government expenditures, right? So government will spend more money. So that is politically easy. That is, increasing government spending in the bad times is politically easy. But if there is full employment and everyone is employed, and we are actually operating at more than full employment level of output, so you cannot decrease spending in good times. So if you want to reduce your deficit because you are running a surplus in inflationary gap situation, so when you have a surplus, it means you are spending less and you are earning more revenues. You means government. But it's not politically easy. Why? Then, people start shouting at you that why you are not spending, why you are not spending money on roads, on bridges, and hospitals. So it's politically not viable. But in difficult times, if government is spending money and running a deficit, it is politically acceptable. People don't mind. Business cycle rarely matches political cycles. So government blame earlier governments for deficit. That is another problem. So for example, if this is the budget, if this is the business cycle, this, and you are here, and suppose this is the recessionary or contractionary phase. So this, let's say this from here to here, this is 3 years. So for 3 years, since the economy is in the contractionary phase of the business cycle, the government is continuously running a deficit and telling the people that, see, we are in the recessionary phase of the business cycle. We have huge unemployment, so we are trying to solve the problem of unemployment by increasing expenditures and decreasing tax revenues, right? But after this point, you have a new government, and this new government will also lavishly spend money and running a deficit. And when they are asked that why you are running a deficit, so this government will argue that the previous government had not used fiscal policy efficiently, And that was the reason that we have to still run a deficit. That's a very serious problem, because political cycle and business cycle does not, overlap actually. So they have different timings. Right? So business cycle really matches political cycles. Now this is fiscal policy and national debt. So I'm going to give you the data on national debt in three different ways. The first table shows net national debt in billions of dollars. Okay, so in its nominal value. So in 1926, it was $2.4 billion. 1940, 3.3. 1946, 13.4 billion. Look at the increase in 1946. 1967, 17.7, and then 1991, $377.7 billion. 2019, $685 billion. So this is in the nominal terms. But people are not concerned about this absolute value, in nominal value of national debt. So we calculate national debt because, for example, if I tell that $685.5 billion is national debt, that is basically overall government deficit, budget deficit. But suppose if you have 1.3 billion people in the country, then this deficit is nothing, $685 billion. But if you have a very low population of 40 million, this is huge. Or 20 million, this is huge. So what we do, we divide these numbers by total population. And we calculate per capita net national debt. So if you look at this, this is per capita. That is, every person has this debt. So in 2019 is $18,370 per person. This is debt. So first let me read this and then I will discuss another problem with this measure. Debt increased significantly to finance World War II, you can see in 1946. Debt increased again since the 1970s due to an increase in income support programs actually. So government spending more money. High interest rate in the 1970s and 1990s hurt as well. Why hurt? Because debt means what? Government is borrowing money. And if interest rates are increasing, then government will have to pay back higher interest on those loans. And who are going to pay these higher interest? Citizens, those taxpayers, because the money is paid from taxes. But again, this debt is not important. For example, if I tell you that I have a debt, personal level, not for the whole country. For example, if I say that, I am in debt and I have to pay back, let's say, $10,000. Now, this $10,000 is meaningless. Why is meaningless? If my annual income is $40,000 and if my annual income is $300,000, it makes hell amount of difference. So if I'm earning $300,000 per year, and if I owe $10,000, it's nothing. But if I'm earning 40,000 and say I owe 10,000, it's huge. So it depends what is your total income. So what we do, instead of calculating per capita national debt in nominal terms, in dollars term, why not we calculate this debt as a percentage of the total income of the country, that is GDP. So if you look at these numbers, look at this. Now we calculate percentage of net national debt as a percentage of GDP or GNP. So now we take the percentage of your income. Your means the country's income. Look at this. In 1926, it was 47%. In 1940, it was 49%. And because of World War II, it is 113%. That is, your debt is even more than GDP. 1967, 23, 1991, 56, and look at this, 2019, is 31% of the total GDP. You can Google, you can just write national debt as a percentage of GDP for all countries in the world, and you will see that some countries have even more than 100% of their GDP. Since 1995, Canada's debt fell to lowest of the G7 countries as well. Now, fiscal policy and national and debt, problems with high deficits or debt. So why we are concerned about balancing our budget? What is wrong with the debt? What is wrong with deficit? What are the problems associated with deficits or debt? So these are some of the problems. Number one, interest payments that must be paid on the foreign held debt. So if you borrow money and if you issue sell bonds to foreigners, you have to pay them interest. Income redistribution effect of large interest payment. What is income redistribution? So by income redistribution, I mean, so suppose I'll just give you an example, simple example. Suppose government sell, let's say, $1,000 bond, right? So this is a bond, let's say the coupon rate is 5%. This is 5% interest. So if you invest 1,000 buying this government bond, the face value of this bond $1,000. After 1 year, you are going to earn 5%. So 5% of this 1,000 is $50. Okay. So suppose I buy this bond for $1,000. Government will receive this $1,000. Government will spend this $1,000. After 1 year, government will have to pay this $50. So this is my income on my investment of $1,000. So I will receive, that is Naved will receive this $50 as income. But who are going to pay this $50? Of course, government. But where does this $50 come from? Government will then impose taxes on other people who do not own these bonds. So basically, these people, these poor people are actually paying this debt or interest payment to these rich people. So there's a redistribution of income. So income is going out from non-bond holders to bond holders. You're getting my point? So it creates income redistribution effect. So that is not of course, those who don't buy these bonds, they are against it, right? The third problem is reduced ability of government to meet the needs of its citizens. Of course, if you keep borrowing money, then you have to pay interest on that bonds. So you won't be able, you don't have enough funds to invest or to, to invest in health sector, education sector, and other infrastructure. Look at this number. Although it's old number, but you can check on the website that I provided for the recent budget. Look at this number. I'll show you. Just give me a sec. Website that I provided for the recent budget. Look at this number. I'll show you. Just give me a sec. Yeah, look at this number. Public debt. See, public debt charges. $23.3 billion in interest and principal payment for these loans. This money is going to those who own these bonds. From where? From non-bond holders. Okay. So this is a big amount. Okay. Now, okay, this is shortcoming. I've already done this. Sorry, this done. Yeah. So these are the four problems. Then we have some invalid criticisms as well. Some of the criticism of the size of the national debt are invalid. So sometimes we think that it is public good is not good, it has problems, but some problems are not true. Unlike a private company, a country cannot go bankrupt. So for government, that is not an issue, that government won't be able to pay back those loans. Government can print money. So that is not the issue for the government. Not only will future generation inherit the debt, they will also inherit the bonds represented by that debt. So people say, remember I showed you that that this is the amount of debt that each person will pay, 18,370. So what we are saying that we each individual owes this amount, 18,370. That's fine, but other people also own these bonds, so they are making money as well. So not only we are paying, but someone is receiving all this money as well. So you can't say we all are paying these debts. It is misleading to concentrate on the debt. The assets of an institution should also be considered. So for example, if government borrows money by issuing bonds and is spent buying more machineries, is spent buying new equipment, machineries, tools. So yes, we do have debts, but also we have more assets as well in the country. The size of the debt should not be considered by itself, but this is I've already discussed, but as a percentage of income, that is GDP. Canada's percentage is very low at 31%, but this is 2019 data, remember this. So now we are in a position to answer this question. It's very simple. I think solution is not given here, so I can just tell you how you calculate debt. So in 2009, suppose before 2009, budget is balanced. Okay, we are assuming budget is balanced. In 2009, you have $100 deficit. So this is, I write, so your national debt is minus 100. Okay, so this is, now I don't need to write minus, because when I say debt, it is already in negative. Okay, so I just write 100. So let me erase this, hold on. Oops, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know, it's not working. Yeah, now it's working. Okay. So let's see this. So this is national debt is 100. Okay. Then in 2010, we have deficit of 200, whatever million dollars, right? So this 200 is added to this 100. So I have 300 national debt. Then we have a surplus of 150. So we have to subtract surplus from debt. So 300 minus 150, I have 150 debt. Then we have minus 140 debt again. So you have to add. So 150 and 140, 290. Then you have 130 surplus. You have to subtract. So 130. So 190, 160. So I subtracted 160. And in 2014, we have a surplus again. So we have to subtract surplus. 160 minus 20, 140. So 140 is national debt in 2014. So that's you just add all deficits and then subtract all surpluses. Okay, and you don't need to write in with a negative number. This is the last question that I want you to solve. The solution is also given here. So let me discuss real quick, probably in next 5 to 10 minutes. The following information, the following is information for the economy of tender where taxes are wholly autonomous. So taxes are autonomous means taxes is not a function of income. There's no marginal tax rate. So this is the information given. Consumption is given as 40 plus 0.4 YD. You know what is 40? 40 is autonomous consumption. 0.8 is marginal propensity to consume. Where YD, that is disposable income, is Y minus T. Government expenditures are autonomous and taxes are autonomous, and they both are equal, 360. Investment is also autonomous, 120. xn, that is net export, is basically a function 107 minus 0.1y. So all this information is given. What is the value of equilibrium income? At equilibrium, what is the amount of budget deficit or budget surplus? If government increased both its spending and taxes by 60, what would be the new equilibrium incomes? These are the three questions. So rather than solving on the screen, I'll show you the solution. That would help me because it's difficult to write on the screen. So first, what we do, we first solve consumption because I want to get rid of this YD. So instead of YD, I write Y minus T, and I know T is 360, which is given in the question. And then I open this bracket with 0.8. So 0.8 times Y and 0.8 times 360, and then I subtract it from 40, I get 248. So this is what consumption, investment, government expenditure, exports. So I can, and I have to equate this Y equal to AE. If you remember in chapter 6, we did this. C plus I plus X plus G. So we get Y equal to 339 plus 0.7Y. I directly calculated. You have to calculate. If you are unable to, then just, send me a message, okay, or text me and I will respond. So I calculated equilibrium income as 1,130. Part B says, is there a deficit or surplus? You don't need to calculate. There's no surplus or deficit. So the budget balance is zero. How do I know? Because they both are equal. If you see here, okay, not here. See here. G and T both are equal. G and T are both equal. So G is equal to T. No deficit, no surplus. So there's no surplus. I don't have to calculate anything. So there's no surplus or deficit because the budget balance is zero. Y is G equal to T. Then zero is the answer. Okay. Now, if government increase its expenditures and taxes by how much? It says if government increase both its spending and taxes by 60. So this is 360. Now it will be 360 plus 60, 420. Now you recalculate everything. So you have to recalculate consumption. Here, if you see, I wrote 360. Now I wrote 420. Here, I took 360. Now it's 420. And you once again solve. When you solve it, you will get this new income. That is 1,170. Okay. And it's still in part C, there is no budget deficit, there's no budget surplus. Why? Because it's still budget deficit, and G and T, they both are equal to 420. So G is also 420, T also 420. So G minus or T minus G, that is tax revenues minus government expenditure, equal to zero. So budget is balanced. So that's all as far as chapter number 7 is concerned. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.